Billionaire opens the door and discovers a shocking truth. The night was dark and restless. The kind that seemed to hold secrets in its howling winds. Heavy rain lashed against the towering windows of Sterling Blackwood's mansion, a grand estate perched on the edge of the city like a silent sentinel. Inside, in the solitude of his private study, Sterling, a 35-year-old self-made billionaire, was absorbed in work. His angular face, usually unreadable in boardrooms and negotiations, was illuminated by the soft glow of his computer screen, his sharp eyes scanning over financial reports that would soon make headlines. The storm outside was relentless, but inside the mansion, there was silence. Sterling's world was one of control, precision, and order. His empire had been built on those very principles, leaving no room for distractions. And yet, as he sat in his tailored charcoal suit, fingers tapping against the desk in steady rhythm, something gnawed at him, a quiet loneliness that no amount of wealth or success could silence. Then, at precisely 11:47 p.m., something happened that shattered the stillness. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was faint, nearly drowned by the storm's rage. Sterling's brow furrowed. He lived alone, aside from his housekeeper, and no one had any reason to visit him at this hour. Perhaps he had imagined it, just the wind rattling the doors. But then, it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Insistent this time, hesitant, yet desperate. A strange unease settled over him. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but something about that knock sent a shiver down his spine. As he pushed back his chair and stood, the floor beneath him felt oddly unsteady, as if fate itself had shifted. He strode out of his study, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors of the vast mansion. The dim glow from the wall sconces cast long shadows along the walls, making the grand space feel eerily hollow. As he reached the front door, his hand hovered over the ornate brass handle, a rare moment of hesitation gripping him. It was an irrational thought, but he somehow knew, if he opened this door, his life would never be the same. And then, he pulled it open. A gust of freezing wind and rain swept inside, momentarily blinding him, blinking against the water droplets. His gaze dropped, and there, standing on the doorstep, was a tiny, shivering figure. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 5. Her drenched light brown hair clung to her small face. Her green eyes, wide with fear and hope, staring up at him. She wore nothing but a faded pink pajama set, completely soaked, her bare feet muddied from the storm. She was trembling violently, her lips turning an unnatural shade of blue from the cold. Sterling's breath caught in his throat. He had expected, well, anything but this. His logical mind immediately demanded answers. Where had she come from? Why was she alone? Who had left her out in this storm? But none of those questions mattered in that moment. Please, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind. I'm lost. Can you help me? The words pierced through him like a knife. He didn't move for a second, his usually sharp mind struggling to process the surreal image before him. He had spent his entire life calculating risks, predicting outcomes, controlling situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. Then instinct took over. My God, child, he breathed, kneeling in front of her, his usually cold voice laced with genuine concern. You must be freezing. Come in, quickly. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, as if unsure whether she could truly trust him. Sterling, ever the businessman, was used to reading people, gauging their intentions, their fears, but he had never seen a look of such pure vulnerability in anyone's eyes before. As soon as she crossed the threshold, he shut the heavy door behind them, sealing out the storm. The warmth of the mansion's grand entrance hall enveloped them, but the little girl continued to shake, her small body convulsing from the cold. What's your name? He asked, his voice softer now, careful not to startle her. Emma, she stammered through chattering teeth. Emma. The name felt strangely familiar, as if it belonged to a memory he couldn't quite grasp. A sudden sensation of déjà vu washed over him, sending another chill down his spine. But now wasn't the time for questions, she needed help. I'm Sterling, he said gently. We need to get you warm. Okay? She nodded timidly, still watching him with those unnervingly familiar green eyes. Reaching for a decorative throw from the nearby sofa, he quickly wrapped it around her small shoulders. As he leaned in to adjust it, His gaze locked onto her face, and suddenly, his heart stopped. There was something about her. The delicate curve of her chin, the shape of her nose, the way her large, expressive eyes studied him with an intensity that was far beyond her years. He had seen those features before. Somewhere. Sterling shook his head, forcing the thought away. This was no time for absurd thoughts. She was just a lost child who needed help. "Susan," he called out, his voice carrying through the vast mansion. "Come quickly. It's urgent." Within seconds, hurried footsteps echoed from upstairs. Susan, his longtime housekeeper, appeared at the top of the staircase. Her face creased with worry as she took in the scene before her. "Oh, heavens," she gasped, rushing down. "What happened?" "She was outside," Sterling explained, his voice tense. "Lost, drenched, and freezing. We need to get her warm." Susan immediately took over, years of maternal instinct kicking in. "Poor thing," she murmured, kneeling beside Emma. "Let's get you into dry clothes and run you a warm bath." "Sweetheart." Emma nodded hesitantly, her eyes still fixed on Sterling, as if afraid he might disappear. But before she could take another step, her eyes fluttered closed, and her small body collapsed. Sterling lunged forward, catching her just before she hit the ground. "Emma." His voice was sharp with panic, an emotion he wasn't accustomed to feeling. She was burning up, her skin radiated unnatural heat even through the soaked pajamas. "She has a fever," Susan said urgently, pressing the back of her hand to Emma's flushed forehead. A high one. Sterling didn't hesitate. For the first time in his life, he acted purely on instinct, not logic, not strategy, but a raw, unshakable need to protect. "I'll take her upstairs," he said, already moving, as he carried the unconscious child through the grand staircase, her small head resting against his chest. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why? Despite every logical explanation, did he feel as if she belonged to him? He didn't know it yet. But in that moment, his life had changed forever. The storm had passed, but the unease in Sterling Blackwood's chest remained, swirling like the remnants of rain in the gutters outside his mansion. The weight of the little girl, Emma, still lingered in his arms. Even though she now lay on the plush guest bed, wrapped in blankets, her small frame dwarfed by the massive room. The fever had stolen the last of her strength, leaving her unconscious, her breath shallow, her skin clammy. Sterling had spent his life making calculated decisions, predicting market trends, and ensuring he was always 2 steps ahead of everyone. Yet here he was, standing over the fragile form of a child, feeling utterly and completely lost. Who was she? The question gnawed at him, sharper than any deal gone wrong or any financial setback. He had expected a night like any other, a late evening of work, a stiff drink before bed, and the empty silence of his house. Instead, fate had thrown this small, fevered girl onto his doorstep, and with her, an unsettling sense of familiarity that he couldn't shake. Susan, his housekeeper, returned with a fresh bowl of cool water and a stack of towels. Her usually composed face was laced with concern as she replaced the damp cloth on Emma's forehead. "Her fever is still too high," she murmured. "We need a doctor. I already called Dr. Lawson. He'll be here soon," Sterling said, though the words felt insufficient. His gaze never left the little girl. Susan studied him for a moment. "She's gotten to you, hasn't she?" Sterling didn't answer. He didn't have to. Minutes stretched into eternity as the doctor arrived and examined Emma with the steady precision of years of medical practice. The verdict was clear: pneumonia. A dangerous one. She needed antibiotics, rest, and careful monitoring over the next 24 hours. Sterling listened to Dr. Lawson's instructions, nodding in all the right places. But his mind was elsewhere. Something didn't fit. "Do you know her parents?" Dr. Lawson asked as he packed up his bag. Sterling hesitated. "No," he admitted. "She showed up on my doorstep, lost and freezing." The doctor's expression tightened with concern. A girl this young, alone in a storm like that? Someone should be looking for her. Someone should. But no one had called. No one had knocked on his door in a frantic search for their missing daughter. The implications sent a chill through him colder than the night air outside. As soon as the doctor left, Sterling turned to Susan. She mentioned living in a shelter with her mother, he said, pacing, and that her mother is sick. Susan's eyes softened. "Then we need to find her." The mother must be worried sick. Sterling knew that was the logical next step. Find the mother. Return the girl. But why did that thought sit so uneasily in his chest? He walked back into the guest bedroom, drawn by something he couldn't explain. Emma stirred, her small hands twitching against the sheets. Her green eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. Sterling leaned forward. "Emma," he said softly, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "You're safe. You're in my home." Her gaze locked onto his, as if trying to place him in her fragmented memories. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she asked, "Where's my mommy?" The tremble in her voice sent a crack through Sterling's guarded heart. "We're going to find her," he promised, the words coming before he could question them. "I need you to tell me everything you remember. Okay?" Emma nodded weakly. "Mommy's been sick for a long time. She coughs a lot." Her tiny hands clenched the blanket. "She said we had to leave where we were living before because she couldn't pay for it anymore. We went to the shelter. But then she got worse. She said we needed food. But I got lost." Her lip quivered, and fresh tears welled in her eyes. "I tried to find my way back. But I couldn't. I was so cold." Sterling swallowed hard. He knew struggle when he saw it. He had clawed his way from nothing to everything. But this kind of struggle, the kind that left a child wandering alone in a storm, was beyond anything he had ever known. "You were very brave," he told her, brushing damp hair away from her flushed face. "And I promise you, we'll find her." As Emma drifted back to sleep, Sterling rose and pulled out his phone. "Robert, I need you to find someone for me." The voice on the other end of the line perked up. "A person? Huh? Must be serious if you're personally asking." Sterling wasn't in the mood for games. "Check every shelter in the city. A sick woman with a young daughter. I want answers before sunrise." "Got it, boss. I'll call you as soon as I find something." As Sterling ended the call, his gaze drifted back to Emma. A sick mother. A child alone in the storm. Something about her story haunted him in ways he couldn't explain. Something about Emma felt personal. It wasn't until the next morning that the call came. Robert's voice was unusually tense. "Sterling, I found her." Sterling exhaled sharply. "Where?" "Sunset Haven Shelter, east side of town. And, there was a pause. "You're going to want to come in person." There was something in Robert's voice. Something that made Sterling's heart pound faster. "What aren't you telling me?" "Just get here," Robert said. "I think you'll want to see this for yourself." The drive felt longer than it was. Sterling had never set foot inside a shelter before. The scent of old fabric, faint disinfectant, and desperation clung to the air. People, families, were scattered across the room, their eyes weary, their bodies weighed down by burdens life had forced them to carry. But Sterling barely noticed any of it, because as soon as he stepped inside, his world tilted on its axis. There, curled up on a thin cot, was Sarah. Sarah, his past, his regret, his first love, and in that moment, as the air was stolen from his lungs, everything fell into place. The green eyes, the shape of her face, the curve of her small hands. Emma wasn't just any child. She was his. Sterling's body felt frozen, his mind scrambling to reconcile the past with the present. Sarah, here, in a shelter, sick and struggling, and all this time, she had been raising his daughter. His daughter. A mixture of rage, sorrow, and disbelief surged through him. Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't he known? Sarah stirred, as if sensing his presence. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion creasing her brow. Then, as she recognized him, a look of pure shock crossed her face. "Sterling?" she whispered, her voice raspy from illness. He took a step forward, but his legs felt unsteady. "Sarah, my God." Tears pooled in her eyes. "How did you?" But Sterling's gaze flickered to the child sleeping down the hall. "Our daughter," he said hoarsely, his voice raw with emotion. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me?" Sarah bit her lip, fresh tears spilling over. "I tried." Her voice broke. "But you were gone. Sterling, you had left." The words hit him like a physical blow. Gone, left. And suddenly, he realized the weight of what he had lost. The life he had abandoned. The love he had thrown away. The daughter he had never known. His knees nearly buckled, but he steadied himself. There would be time for anger later. Time for regrets. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. Fixing this. Fighting for them. For Sarah. For Emma. For the family he had never known he had. but now would never let go of. Sterling Blackwood had always believed in logic. Numbers, percentages, investments, things that could be calculated, controlled, and predicted. But there was nothing logical about the way his life had unraveled in the past 24 hours. He stood frozen in the dimly lit room of the shelter, his breath trapped in his chest, his gaze locked onto Sarah Monroe, the woman he once loved, the woman he hadn't seen in years, lying on a threadbare cot, sick and frail. And now, the truth had hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. The realization was almost too much to process. The green eyes, the shape of her face, the way she had looked up at him with a strange familiarity, it all made sense now. How had he not seen it before? How had he been so blind? Sarah, his voice came out in a hushed whisper, filled with 1,000 questions and emotions he couldn't yet name. Sarah's lips parted, and her breath caught, her fevered body trembling as she pushed herself up on the cot. Her hair, once vibrant and full of life, clung damply to her forehead, and the shadows under her eyes told a story he hadn't been there to witness. He swallowed hard. "How long have you been here?" Sarah didn't answer at first. Instead, she just looked at him, the way she had looked at him years ago. Before everything had crumbled, before he had walked away from their relationship for the sake of his ambition. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the past. Then, finally, she spoke. "Too long," she whispered. Sterling's fists clenched. He had never known Sarah to be weak. She was the strongest woman he had ever met. But now, sitting in this rundown shelter, her shoulders thin beneath the blanket draped over them, she looked fragile, breakable, and it was all his fault. His mind raced back to the last time he had seen her, back when his only focus was building his empire. When he had believed love was a distraction, something that didn't belong in the world of boardrooms and business takeovers. He had left her behind, thinking it was the right decision. And now? Now, he stood before the aftermath of his choices. "You're sick," he said, his voice tight. "Have you seen a doctor?" Sarah gave a hollow laugh, one that held no humor. "Doctors cost money, Sterling. I barely have enough to keep Emma fed. Do you think I can afford hospital bills?" The sharp stab of guilt made his stomach churn. All these years, he had been thriving, building a financial empire, living in a mansion, drinking the finest wine, wearing custom-tailored suits. And meanwhile, Sarah and Emma had been living in shelters, struggling for basic necessities. His jaw clenched. "No, this was unacceptable. Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me I had a daughter?" Sarah flinched at the anger in his tone. But when she lifted her gaze, there was a quiet strength in her tired eyes. "I tried," she said simply. Sterling blinked, his breath hitching. "What?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "I called, Sterling, over and over again. I left messages at your office. I sent emails, but you never responded. I even went to your house once. But," she hesitated, and then her expression hardened. "But I was turned away at the gate." Sterling's stomach twisted into a painful knot. No, that wasn't possible. He would have remembered a call from Sarah. He would have, unless, his blood turned to ice. "My mother," he said, the words barely above a whisper. Sarah let out a slow exhale. "Yes, your mother. She made sure I never got through to you. And when I finally managed to speak with her, she told me in no uncertain terms that I needed to disappear from your life. That you had a future ahead of you. One that a baby would ruin." Rage, pure, seething rage flooded through him like a wildfire. His mother, Elizabeth Blackwood, the iron-fisted matriarch of the Blackwood dynasty, had done this. She had taken his child away from him. She had let Sarah suffer alone. Sterling clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. Everything made sense now. Why Sarah had vanished from his life so abruptly. Why he had never heard from her again. He had spent years believing she had walked away from him, when in truth, his own mother had orchestrated it all. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. What had he done? How had he let this happen? "Sterling." Sarah's voice was softer now, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. "That was years ago. We can't change what happened. Maybe not, but he sure as hell could change what happened next. I'm taking you both home," he said, finality in his tone. Sarah's brows furrowed. "What? You heard me," Sterling said, stepping closer. "You and Emma are coming home with me. Right now." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Sterling, I don't need your charity. It's not charity, Sarah, he shot back. It's me fixing what never should have been broken in the first place. She shook her head. It's too late for that. The hell it is, Sterling growled. You think I'm going to walk away again? After learning I have a daughter? After seeing what you've been through? Sarah bit her lip, looking away, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. Sterling softened his tone. Let me help, Sarah, please, not just for you, for Emma. She deserves more than this. That was what did it. The moment he mentioned Emma, something in Sarah cracked. She closed her eyes, her breath shuddering as a single tear slipped down her cheek. You really think you can just walk back into our lives? She whispered. Sterling's chest ached at the pain in her voice. No, he admitted. I don't expect this to be easy. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I can't change the past. Sarah, what I can do is fight for the future. A long silence stretched between them. And then, finally, Sarah gave a small, exhausted nod. All right, she whispered. Sterling felt relief rush through him so fast it was almost dizzying. All right, he echoed. Sarah swallowed hard. But Sterling, if you break her heart, if you walk away this time, I won't, he promised. And he meant it. Because as he stood there, looking at the woman he had loved and the daughter he had never known, Sterling Blackwood vowed that he would never let them go again. The drive back to Sterling Blackwood's mansion was silent, but the air inside the car crackled with emotion. Emma, still weak from her fever, was curled up in the backseat, her small hands gripping a stuffed bear the shelter had given her. Sarah, her mother, his first love, the woman he never stopped thinking about, sat beside him, staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Sterling stole glances at her whenever he could, but she never turned to meet his gaze. He had expected this. He had dragged her and their daughter out of the only life they had known for the past 5 years. Sarah had been abandoned, betrayed by him, and now he was asking her to trust him again. It wouldn't be easy, but he would fight for this. He would fight for them. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. For so long, he had believed that walking away from love was the only way to succeed. That emotions were weaknesses, that commitment would slow him down. But now, as he watched Emma sleep in the rearview mirror, his daughter, the child he never knew he had, he realized just how much he had lost because of that belief. And he would not lose them again. The mansion loomed ahead. Its towering walls, once symbols of his power and wealth, now felt cold and empty. What was all of this? The money, the business, the empire, if it meant nothing without them? As the car came to a stop, Sterling turned to Sarah. Come inside, he said gently. She hesitated. Sterling, please, he interrupted, his voice quieter this time. Just for tonight, you and Emma need rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Sarah exhaled slowly, then nodded. Just for tonight. He didn't miss the hesitation in her voice. She was waiting for him to fail her again. She had every right to. But this time, he wouldn't. He stepped out and opened the back door, lifting Emma carefully into his arms. She stirred slightly, blinking groggily. Shush, he whispered. You're home now. Home. The word felt foreign, but as he held his daughter close to his chest for the first time, he realized it had never felt more right. Susan, his housekeeper, appeared at the entrance, her eyes widening in shock as she took in the sight before her. Mr. Blackwood? She asked carefully, her gaze flickering from him to Sarah to the sleeping child in his arms. Sterling didn't explain. Not yet. Instead, he just said, prepare the guest room. Emma needs to sleep. Susan nodded and hurried inside. Sterling carried Emma up the stairs, Sarah following behind at a distance. When he reached the room, he gently placed the child onto the bed. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her, memorizing every detail. Her tiny hands, her soft breathing, the way she clutched the bear in her sleep. She was his, and he had missed everything. Downstairs, Sarah sat on the leather couch in the living room, her arms wrapped around herself. Sterling knew she was building a wall around her heart, preparing for another storm. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, one for himself, the other untouched, just in case she wanted it. Then, he sat across from her. Neither spoke for a long moment. The mansion was too quiet. Finally, Sterling took a deep breath. I didn't know, Sarah. I swear to God, I didn't know about Emma. Sarah's jaw tightened. I wanted to believe you would have cared. But, Sterling, the fact is, you weren't there. I was alone. I was pregnant and scared. And when I needed you the most, you were gone. The weight of her words slammed into him like a punch to the gut. She was right. I should have been there. He admitted, his voice raw. I should have never left you. Sarah scoffed, shaking her head. And what? You would have put your billion-dollar business on hold for me? For a baby? We both know that's not who you were. Sterling. Sterling flinched at the past tense. She thought he was still the same man. She thought he hadn't changed. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I know I made mistakes. But I want to fix them. Sarah let out a hollow laugh. You think you can just buy our forgiveness? That you can throw money at the past and make it go away? That's not what I'm trying to do. He said firmly. I don't care about money. I care about Emma. I care about you. Sarah's eyes flickered with something that almost looked like hope. But she buried it quickly. You don't just get to walk back into our lives and play hero. She whispered. I know, Sterling said, but I'm not leaving. Not this time. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, Sarah whispered, she deserves better than someone who might leave again. And that was what shattered him. He had already lost 5 years of his daughter's life. He had missed her first steps, her first words, her first everything. Sarah was terrified he would leave again, that he would abandon Emma the way he had abandoned their love. Sterling's throat tightened. You have every reason not to trust me, he admitted, but let me prove to you that I'm not the same man I was before. Let me be her father. Let me be there. Sarah looked away, her eyes glistening. For the first time since he found her, she looked conflicted. Over the next few days, Sterling did what no one expected of him. He didn't go back to work. He didn't hide behind his money. He didn't disappear into his office and throw his problems onto someone else. Instead, he stayed. He cooked breakfast for Emma. Even though his culinary skills were questionable at best, he helped her brush her hair, helped her pick out her clothes for the day, read her bedtime stories every night. And slowly, Emma started trusting him. She started calling him Dad. She started reaching for his hand when they walked together. She started falling asleep with her head against his chest. And it was the most terrifying, heartwarming, earth-shattering feeling Sterling had ever known. He didn't care about board meetings anymore. He didn't care about stock prices. The only thing that mattered was her. Sarah saw it, too. She saw how he put Emma first. How he stayed up all night when Emma had another fever. How he made Emma laugh when she was scared. And Sterling saw something in Sarah, too. He saw the way she started watching him differently. The way she softened when he kissed Emma's forehead. The way she lingered when he pulled a blanket over her shoulders when she fell asleep on the couch. There was still hurt in her eyes. But there was also something else. Something like hope. One night, as Sterling tucked Emma into bed, she grabbed his hand. Are you going to stay? She asked sleepily. Sterling's throat tightened. Forever, he whispered. Emma smiled and closed her eyes. And in that moment, he knew. He wasn't just fighting for a second chance. He was fighting for his family. And this time, he wouldn't lose them. If you believe in second chances, if you believe Sterling deserves to make things right, like this post, comment below, and let's show him our support. The early morning light spilled through the windows of Sterling Blackwood's mansion, casting soft shadows across the grand hall. But for the first time in years, the house felt different. It no longer felt like an empty palace, sterile, cold, a fortress of wealth and loneliness. Now, there was life inside it. The smell of coffee and syrup lingered in the air, mixing with the soft sound of Emma's giggles from the dining room. Sterling stood in the doorway, watching his daughter, as she sat at the massive oak table. Her little hands gripping a fork too big for her as she tried to cut her pancake. Her laughter filled the space in ways money never could. And beside her, Sarah. She wasn't laughing. Not yet. She sat quietly, watching their daughter with wary eyes. Like she was still waiting for something, waiting for him to fail. Waiting for the Sterling she had once known, the one who had chosen ambition over love, to show up and walk away again. But that wasn't who he was anymore. Sterling cleared his throat and stepped into the room. Emma's face lit up as soon as she saw him. Daddy, she called, reaching for him. The word sent a rush of warmth through his chest every time she said it. He would never get used to it. And yet, It felt like the most natural thing in the world. Sterling walked over and ruffled her hair. "Good morning, sweetheart. How's the pancake battle going?" Emma pouted. "The pancake is winning." He chuckled, pulling out a chair beside her. "Want some help?" She nodded enthusiastically, and Sterling carefully cut her pancake into small bites, watching as she happily stuffed them into her mouth. Sarah was still quiet, still watching. He turned to her, meeting her guarded gaze. "Did you sleep okay?" She hesitated. "Yeah, it was different. Being here again." Sterling nodded. He knew what she wasn't saying, that sleeping under the same roof as him brought back memories of the past. Memories she wasn't sure she wanted to revisit. But he wasn't going to push her. Not yet. Because this wasn't just about winning her back. It was about proving to her, proving to both of them, that he was here to stay. Later that afternoon, Sterling stood outside his mother's estate, staring at the grand entrance that had once been his home. Elizabeth Blackwood had built an empire with an iron will and a heart of stone. She had shaped him into the man he was today, molded him into a ruthless businessman who made decisions based on logic, not emotion. And she had stolen years from him, years he could have spent knowing his daughter, loving Sarah. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he rang the bell. The door swung open within seconds, and there she stood, Elizabeth Blackwood, the woman who had controlled every aspect of his life until now. "Sterling," she greeted, cool and composed as always. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Sterling didn't waste time. "You knew." His mother barely blinked. "Knew what?" "Don't," he growled. "Don't play games with me. You knew about Sarah. You knew about Emma. You kept them from me." A flicker of something, guilt, flashed in her eyes before she straightened her spine. "I did what was necessary. Sterling, you had a future ahead of you. And I wasn't going to let a mistake ruin it." Mistake. The word sent rage surging through his veins. His mother had looked at Sarah, the woman he had loved, and seen a liability. She had known about Emma, his daughter, and chosen to erase her existence from his life. "She wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and neither was Emma." His mother sighed, as if he was a child throwing a tantrum. "Sterling, you were young. You had ambition, potential. And I still do." He cut in. "But none of it means anything if I don't have my family." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "So this is what you want now? A second chance? A happy little family?" She shook her head. "She won't forgive you. She won't trust you." "She will," Sterling countered, "because I'll earn it, and there's nothing you can do to stop me this time." For the first time, his mother looked shaken, because she knew he had changed. And she knew she had lost. Sterling walked back into the mansion that evening, his mind still racing with the confrontation. He had left his mother's house with no regrets. He had spent years making the wrong decisions, letting the wrong people influence him. Never again. He found Sarah in the living room, sitting alone, staring at the crackling fireplace. She didn't look up when he entered. "Emma's asleep," she said softly. "She kept asking if you were coming back." His heart clenched. He walked over and sat beside her. "I went to see my mother." Sarah turned then, her eyebrows knitting together. "Why?" "Because I needed to hear the truth from her." He exhaled, rubbing his face. "She admitted it, Sarah. She admitted to keeping you away from me." Sarah swallowed hard, looking away. For so long, she had believed Sterling had abandoned her. She had believed she had been unwanted, disposable. But now, she knew the truth. He reached for her hand hesitantly. "I know it doesn't change what happened. And I know I have to make up for the years I lost." He swallowed, voice thick. "But I'm here now. I will never walk away from you and Emma again." Sarah's fingers curled around his, gripping tightly. "Sterling," she whispered. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Would she trust him again? Would she let him stay? She took a shaky breath, then looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "You had to prove it," she whispered. And Sterling, for the first time in his life, smiled. "Then I will." Because this wasn't just about getting a second chance. It was about proving he deserved it. And he would. For Sarah. For Emma. For the family he had almost lost. The morning started like any other. Sterling Blackwood woke up earlier than usual. His first instinct no longer to check the stock market or his company's latest acquisition, but to check on Emma. He walked down the quiet hallway of his mansion, pausing at her bedroom door, listening to the soft, steady sound of her breathing. She had been here for only a few weeks, But already, everything felt different. The house no longer echoed with silence. The once empty dining table was now filled with laughter, messy breakfasts, and tiny fingers sticky with syrup. The cold, calculated life he had built for himself had been replaced with something real. Something fragile yet powerful. And for the first time in his entire life, Sterling wasn't afraid of losing money or business deals, he was afraid of losing them. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as he turned back toward the stairs. And then his phone rang. It was early, too early, and the name flashing across the screen sent a cold feeling through his stomach. Clara, his assistant. Something was wrong. Sterling answered, his voice steady but tense. What is it? There was silence on the other end. A hesitation. Then, sir, you need to see this. Seconds later, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. A link. Sterling's fingers trembled slightly as he tapped on it. The moment the webpage loaded, his heart stopped. It was a headline. A brutal, sensationalized, front-page headline. Billionaire Sterling Blackwood's secret love child exposed. Who is the mystery mother? Below the headline was a photo, grainy but unmistakable. It showed him, Sarah, and Emma outside the school yesterday. The three of them together. Sterling's stomach plummeted. The world knew, before he could even process the implications. Another call came in. His mother. He already knew what was coming. With a sigh, he answered. Sterling, came Elizabeth Blackwood's sharp, unrelenting voice. Tell me this isn't true. Sterling closed his eyes. What part? The part where my son, one of the most powerful men in the country, has an illegitimate daughter that he's been keeping secret. The part where you've single-handedly destroyed everything we've built with a single reckless decision. The words hit him like knives. And for the first time in his life, they didn't cut. Because Elizabeth Blackwood had built this empire on control, power, and calculated perfection. But Sterling? He was done living by her rules. You knew, he said quietly. You knew about Sarah, about Emma, and instead of telling me, you made them disappear. His mother hesitated. I did what was necessary to protect you. Sterling. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Protect me? You robbed me of 5 years with my daughter. With the woman I loved. Do you know what they went through while I was sitting in a goddamn penthouse thinking they had walked away from me? Elizabeth's voice wavered for the first time. Sterling, listen to me. You have responsibilities. A scandal like this will ruin. I don't care. He cut in. His voice was calm, but inside, his pulse was thundering. Because he meant it. I don't care about the company. About the press. About what people think of me. The only thing I care about now is my family. Elizabeth's silence stretched for so long that he thought she might have hung up. Then, finally, she said, You're making a mistake. Sterling exhaled. Maybe, but if loving my daughter is a mistake, then it's the only one I'll ever be proud of. He ended the call. And then, chaos erupted. By the time Sterling walked into the kitchen, Sarah was already awake, sitting at the table, clutching her phone with a look of pure devastation. She had seen it. She had seen the headline. Sterling, she whispered. There was hurt in her voice. Fear. And worst of all, a flicker of betrayal. You told me you would protect her, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Sterling's stomach twisted. I didn't do this, he said quickly. I don't know who leaked the story. But I swear to you, I had no part in it. Sarah let out a breath, pressing a hand to her forehead. This is a nightmare. Do you know what this means? Paparazzi, reporters, people showing up at Emma's school. She's just a child. Sterling, I know, he said, his voice thick with guilt, with frustration, with rage at the world for dragging them into the spotlight. And I will handle this. How? Sarah's voice cracked. How do you fix something like this? Sterling's jaw clenched. By facing it. Sterling had spent years hiding behind power, behind wealth, behind control. But this time? He walked straight into the storm. By noon, he was standing at the front of his company's headquarters, facing a wall of cameras. Reporters shouting his name, flashing lights blinding him. Behind him, Sarah and Emma remained inside. Safe, protected. He would not let the world tear them apart. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. And for the first time in his life, he spoke not as a businessman, but as a father. Many of you have seen the headlines this morning. Let me set the record straight. The crowd hushed. I have a daughter, he said simply, his voice unwavering. Her name is Emma. She is the most incredible, Beautiful, kind little girl I have ever met. And I will not let the media, or anyone else, turn her life into a spectacle. Cameras flashed wildly. Sterling continued, for 5 years, I didn't know she existed. Not because of choice, but because someone made that choice for me. I missed out on her first steps, her first words, her first everything, and I will not miss another moment of her life because of gossip or headlines. A murmur rippled through the press. You want a scandal? Sterling challenged. Fine, print this. I am a father. And I will fight for my family. No matter what it takes. Silence. Then, applause. It started small, but it grew, reporters lowering their cameras. People nodding, even smiling. Because this wasn't just a billionaire scandal anymore. It was a story about a father who refused to let the world take his daughter away from him. Sterling turned and walked away. That night, as he sat in Emma's room, watching her sleep, he felt Sarah's presence before she even spoke. You really meant all of that, didn't you? She murmured. Sterling turned to look at her. And for the first time since this all started, her eyes held something other than fear. Trust. I meant every word, he whispered. I would walk through fire for her. And for you. Sarah's breath hitched. She didn't answer. Not yet. But she didn't pull away when he reached for her hand. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he was finally proving that he wasn't going anywhere. Do you believe in second chances? Drop a comment below to show your support for Sterling as he fights for his family. The tension in the Blackwood mansion was suffocating. Sterling stood in the hallway, his fists clenched at his sides, heart pounding. The conversation he was about to have would change everything, for him. For Sarah, for Emma, for all of them. For days, the media storm had raged on. Paparazzi had camped outside his home. Reporters had twisted every word of his statement into a spectacle. And social media was flooded with 1,000 different versions of the truth. But none of it mattered. Emma mattered. Sarah mattered. Their future together mattered. And today, he would fight for that future. He inhaled sharply, steadying himself before pushing open the heavy wooden doors of his mother's grand study. Elizabeth Blackwood sat at her desk, poised and untouchable, her expression unreadable, the same expression she had worn his entire life, one of control, of calculation, of authority. But this time, Sterling wasn't a boy seeking her approval. This time, he was a man ready to tear down the walls she had built between him and his family. She lifted her gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. I assume you're here to continue this spectacle? Sterling's jaw tightened. I'm here for the truth. Elizabeth sighed, as if bored by the entire ordeal. What more truth do you need? Sterling, you've already made a fool of yourself by standing in front of the press, declaring your commitment to a woman who abandoned you. She didn't abandon me. You made sure I abandoned her. His mother's expression froze. For the first time, he saw it, guilt. It was faint, barely noticeable beneath her hardened mask. But it was there. You told Sarah to stay away. Sterling continued, voice low and filled with the weight of years lost. You made her believe I wouldn't want her. That I wouldn't want my daughter. You stole 5 years from me. 5 years I will never get back. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. You were young, she said, though her voice had lost its certainty. You had a future ahead of you. You couldn't afford. Afford what? He snapped. A family? Love? A daughter who needed me. Do you hear yourself, mother? Her lips parted slightly, as if struggling to find an argument that would justify her actions. But there was nothing she could say to make this right. She had spent her life molding him into a perfect successor. She had ensured he followed in her footsteps. That he built power, influence, legacy. But what she had never understood, what she had stolen from him, was the one thing he truly needed. A family. I thought I was protecting you, she said finally, her voice quieter. I didn't want you to make the same mistakes your father made. Sterling exhaled slowly, staring at her. This was the first time she had ever spoken of his father. His father, the man who had abandoned them, who had walked away without looking back. The man Elizabeth had hardened herself against. The man she had feared Sterling would become. But she had failed to see the difference. I am not my father, Sterling said, his voice firm but calm. And Sarah is not some opportunist who wanted to ruin my life. She loved me, and I loved her. And Emma is the best thing that has ever happened to me. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the desk. You really love them. she murmured, more to herself than to him. Sterling swallowed hard, emotions tightening his throat. With everything I have. The silence stretched thick and heavy between them. Then, Elizabeth did something Sterling never expected. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were softer, not weak, but tired, regretful. I was wrong, she admitted. Sterling's breath hitched. He had never, in his entire life, heard his mother say those words. She exhaled shakily. I can't give you back the years you lost. But if you'll let me, I would like to make things right. With you, with Sarah, and with Emma. Sterling stared at her, his heart hammering. Could he forgive her? Could he let her be a part of his daughter's life after everything? Then, he thought of Emma, the way she had asked about his family. About whether she had a grandmother. The way she longed for something bigger than just the two of them. And Sterling, he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He nodded slowly. You're going to have to earn it, he said, voice steady but not unkind. His mother gave a faint, almost sad smile. I would expect nothing less. And just like that, the past shifted. It didn't disappear. The wounds were still there. But maybe, just maybe, healing had finally begun. That evening, as Sterling walked back into the mansion, the home that had once felt empty but now held everything that mattered, he found Sarah standing in the doorway. She had been waiting for him. How did it go? She asked quietly. Sterling exhaled. Better than I expected. Sarah studied him, searching his face for the truth. And then, for the first time since she had stepped back into his life, she reached for his hand. Sterling's breath caught. It was the smallest gesture. But it meant everything. I saw your press conference, Sarah murmured. Sterling's chest tightened. And? Sarah hesitated, then whispered, you meant every word, didn't you? He looked her in the eyes, really looked at her, and nodded. Every single one. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of his promise. Then, she smiled. A small, hesitant smile. But it was a beginning. And when Emma ran into the room moments later, arms outstretched, Sterling lifted her into his arms without hesitation, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Are we a family now? She asked sleepily, hope in her voice. Sterling glanced at Sarah, and when she nodded, he knew. Yes, he whispered, we're a family. For the first time in his entire life, Sterling Blackwood had everything he had ever wanted. And this time, he wouldn't let it go. The day had finally come. The day Sterling Blackwood never thought he would live to see. His mansion, once a fortress of loneliness, now brimmed with life, laughter, and warmth. The same house that had once echoed with the silence of a man who had built his empire alone was now filled with the sounds of family. And today? Today, everything would change forever. Sterling stood at the edge of the sprawling garden, where the sun filtered softly through the ancient oak trees. Rows of white chairs were neatly arranged, forming an aisle that led to a simple but elegant floral arch. The place where he would finally marry Sarah. His heart pounded in his chest, not out of fear, but out of something bigger than fear. Something deeper. He was about to become a husband. But more than that, he was about to officially become the father he had promised Emma he would be. He exhaled shakily, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His best man, Robert, his oldest friend and the one who had helped him find Sarah again, clapped a hand on his shoulder. Nervous? Robert asked with a smirk. Sterling let out a breathless laugh. Terrified. Robert chuckled. That's a good sign. Means you actually care about getting it right this time. And he did. God, he did. The soft melody of the violin began to play. Guests turned, murmuring in awe. Sterling lifted his gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. Sarah, walking toward him in a dress as radiant as the sun, as soft as a whisper of the past and future woven together. Her hair curled in soft waves, a delicate veil cascading behind her. Her lips trembled, her eyes, those same green eyes that Emma had inherited, filled with so many emotions he thought his heart might burst. And beside her, Emma, dressed in a tiny, ivory dress, holding a small bouquet, grinning from ear to ear as she walked beside her mother. Their daughter, their everything. Sterling felt his vision blur as he took them in. Sarah, the woman who had always been his greatest what-if, his biggest regret, and now, his future. And Emma, the daughter he had almost lost, but who had given him a second chance to be the man he should have been all along. As they walked toward him, Step by step, his chest tightened. How had he ever thought his life was complete without them? The past, the lost years, the pain, they all melted away in that moment. Because now, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Sarah reached the altar, and Sterling extended his hand. She hesitated, for just a fraction of a second, before slipping her fingers into his. And when she did, Sterling knew. He was home. The officiant spoke, but Sterling barely heard him. His heart was too full, too overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. When it was time for the vows, he turned to Sarah, his hands shaking slightly as he held hers. He had never been a man of words. His power had always been in numbers, in deals, in negotiations. But this wasn't business. This was everything. He exhaled shakily and began. Sarah, I have made more mistakes in my life than I can count. And the biggest one, the one I will regret for the rest of my life, is letting you walk away. Sarah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I can't change the past. I can't take back the years we lost. But what I can do, what I promise to do, is spend every single day proving to you and Emma that I will never walk away again. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek. Sterling squeezed her hands tighter. You are my home. You and Emma are my world. And I swear to you, with everything I have, that I will love you both for the rest of my life. Sarah let out a soft, broken laugh, shaking her head. You always did know how to close a deal. The guests chuckled softly, but Sterling only had eyes for her. Then, Sarah took a breath and spoke. Sterling, when I first met you, you were the most frustrating man I had ever known. More laughter from the crowd. But you were also the man I loved, she whispered, and the man I lost. And somehow, against all odds, you found your way back to me. Her voice broke, and Sterling reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek. You were my first love. And after everything, after all the pain, after all the lost time, you're still my last. And I don't want to live another day without you. Sterling's throat tightened so much he could barely breathe. And I don't want Emma to live another day wondering if we're a family. Sarah continued. She turned, looking down at their daughter, who watched them with wide, hopeful eyes. Because we are, and we always will be. Emma smiled, and Sterling knew, in that moment, this was right. This was how their story was meant to end. Not with heartbreak, not with regret, but with love. By the power vested in me, the officiant announced. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Sterling, you may kiss your bride. Sterling didn't hesitate. He pulled Sarah into his arms. And he kissed her like it was the first time all over again. Like he had never lost her. Like she had always been his. The guests erupted into cheers. And Emma clapped her hands excitedly, jumping up and down as she yelled. We did it. We're a family. Sterling pulled away, laughing breathlessly, and turned to their daughter. Then, in front of everyone, he knelt down, holding out his arms. Come here, princess. Emma ran straight into them, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. And there, with Sarah in his arms, with Emma pressed against his chest, with the sun setting behind them in a sky painted in shades of gold and pink, Sterling Blackwood finally understood what it meant to have everything. Because this wasn't just a wedding. It was a second chance. A fresh start. A family that had been broken and battered, but had found its way back together. And this time, he would never let them go. The sun had long set, casting a golden glow over the sprawling gardens of Sterling Blackwood's estate. The celebration had ended hours ago. Yet he, Sarah, and Emma remained outside, unwilling to let the night slip away too quickly. The fairy lights strung between the trees flickered like fireflies, illuminating the new chapter they had just begun. Sterling sat on the soft grass, his arms wrapped protectively around Emma, who had nestled into his chest, her tiny body warm against him. Sarah sat beside them, her fingers intertwined with his, the wedding band on her hand catching the light. They were a family, finally. No more missed years, no more regrets, no more wondering what could have been. Sterling inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of blooming roses and the faint aroma of wedding cake still lingering in the air. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace. He wasn't thinking about board meetings. He wasn't thinking about stock prices. He wasn't calculating risks and gains. He was just here, in this moment, with them. Sarah sighed contentedly, tilting her head to look at him. You know, she mused, If someone had told me 5 years ago that we'd be sitting here, married, watching our daughter fall asleep in your arms, I would have laughed in their face. Sterling smirked. You used to do that a lot. She chuckled. I still do. His smile softened. I know. There was something about this. About being able to joke with her again. To share moments of pure, unguarded joy, that made him realize just how far they had come. He had spent years thinking love was a distraction, that emotions were a weakness, that his empire, his fortune, his legacy, his reputation, was all that mattered. But in the end, what was wealth without love? What was success if you had no one to share it with? He had almost lost them. Almost. And now? He would spend the rest of his life proving that they had made the right choice in giving him a second chance. Sarah, he said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. She turned to him, eyes filled with curiosity. You saved me, he admitted, his throat tightening. I spent so many years believing that love made people weak, that opening your heart made you vulnerable. He swallowed hard. But you and Emma, you showed me what true strength is. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, her eyes shimmering with understanding. You know, she said softly, I spent years hating you, resenting you, wishing I had never met you. Sterling's stomach twisted at the admission, but he didn't look away. But, she continued, even at my angriest, even at my loneliest, there was always this tiny part of me that hoped, just hoped, that you would find us. That you would show up one day and prove me wrong. Her voice caught slightly, and she let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. And, God help me, Sterling, you did. Sterling swallowed the lump in his throat, shifting Emma slightly so he could cup Sarah's face with his free hand. I will never leave you again, he vowed. I don't care what it takes. I don't care how hard it gets, you and Emma are my home. Sarah closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. I believe you, she whispered. And for Sterling, that was everything. Because earning Sarah's love was one thing, but earning her trust? That was priceless. As the night deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past fading into the distance, replaced by hope, love, and an unshakable bond. Sterling thought about the lessons he had learned, the lessons that had changed his life. 1. Money can build an empire, but it can't build a family. Sterling had spent his entire life chasing wealth, power, and success, thinking they would bring him happiness. But happiness wasn't found in a bank account. It was found in the laughter of a child, in the touch of someone who loved you unconditionally, in the simple, everyday moments. 2. Love requires effort. Love wasn't something you could buy. It wasn't something you could demand. It had to be earned. It had to be fought for. He had learned, painfully, that love meant putting others before yourself. It meant showing up, even when it was hard. 3. Forgiveness is a choice. Sarah had every reason to walk away from him forever. And yet, she had chosen to forgive. Not because it was easy, but because love is stronger than anger. And hope is more powerful than pain. 4. Family is worth the fight. No obstacle, no scandal, no mistake was bigger than the love of a family. He had almost lost everything because of his pride. But in the end, love had won. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and blues, Sterling finally stood, lifting Emma into his arms as she stirred sleepily. Let's go inside, he murmured. Sarah nodded, standing as well. But just as they reached the mansion, Emma, still half asleep, murmured against his shoulder. Daddy? Sterling's heart clenched at the word. Yeah, sweetheart? Emma yawned. Do we get to do this every day now? Sterling met Sarah's gaze, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. Yes, princess, he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Every single day. Sarah sighed softly, resting her head against his arm as they walked inside. And in that moment, Sterling knew, this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. What do you think about Sterling's journey? Do you believe in second chances and the power of love? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspiring stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Sparkles. Because sometimes, the best stories are the ones that remind us that love always finds a way.